This video is brought to you by the good folks at KEH. Not only is KEH the oldest and biggest at what they do, buying and selling exclusively used camera gear of all sorts since 1979, but they do it well, with integrity and both a 180-day warranty and 21-day return policy, free shipping on transactions over $49. Which is why, because they make it as futz-free a process as possible, they are our go-to whenever we are looking to fund new purchases by selling our own gear or buying that special used piece of kit properly graded and checked when we want to go quirky or old school. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. Macro photography is usually defined as the photography of small objects, but because I dislike any definition which includes the word itself, it's just lazy. I'll put it this way. Macro photography is the art and science of making little things look big, and then capturing those images to film or a digital sensor at a reproduction ratio of between, say, 1:2 and 1:1, give or take, which you can also express as 0.5x and 1x magnification, respectively. Hold that thought, although I want to be clear that I am not talking about microphotography, which, with magnifications not uncommon up to 20x, that is reproduction ratio of 20:1, is usually the realm of more specialized equipment. Although one might argue that magnification between these two endpoints is the realm of extension tubes and bellows, even reversing the lens or auxiliary lenses, but I'm not going to cover this range or these approaches either, because I don't like futzing with things. And because the really interesting thing, the most important thing, I think anyway, is this. Macro photography is already enough to allow you to see things in a way you simply cannot see with the naked eye, both external, that is, the world around us, which is obvious enough and rewarding enough, and really beyond that, internal. That is, recognizing something about ourselves in the process and end result of capturing those kind of images, a Rorschach test, if you will. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today I want to talk about something I never have until now, the whys and hows of macro photography. Of course, these are the opinions of just one man. Your mileage may vary, and that's fine, as always. Now, I've just given you my sense, decades after my own introduction to the genre, of what is most important about the why of macro photography, the insight it can yield into ourselves. But of course, there are other just as or more valid whys, like obviating the need for and expense of travel. In fact, one of the great things about macro photography is that you need look no further than your backyard. Cue the "there's no place like home" scene from The Wizard of Oz. If you do travel, macro photography can inspire a hunt for something extraordinary in the mundane. Even if the location itself is extraordinary, a way to appreciate time and place even more deeply. In either case, I'm talking about going way beyond nature or the built environment that one can easily see to the components, the building blocks, the abstractions of those environments, which can be so far from obvious that when we find them, we find a little bit of ourselves. Like walking the dog, spying a frozen puddle, and in that puddle, seeing an aerial reconnaissance map of Ukraine. Maybe feeling the heartbreak, frustration, or anger of foreign policy predicated first, as is almost always the case, on power rather than morality. Or walking through a local park and really seeing the magnificent complexity of nature in a single leaf, and in that complexity being fascinated by, rather than afraid of, a disease wreaking havoc inside your own body and its extraordinary fight against it. Okay, I think that's enough poetry for today. You get the point. And hey, macro lenses are also often the way to go for much more prosaic purposes like product shots. So let's shift our attention to gear. If you ask me, macro photography in 2022 starts with a WYSIWYG viewfinder. What you see is what you get in order to preview the frame, depth of field and exposure, maybe even motion blur in real time, even before tripping the shutter, which means parallax-constrained rangefinders and ground glass DSLRs need not apply. Not that they can't be used for this purpose, but life is short, and as you already know, my personal ambition is to spend as little time futzing with gear as possible. An articulating screen is a big help too. I think one's priorities in selecting macro photography gear ought to then move on to image stabilization, either lens or in body, because if you can avoid a tripod, the capture becomes so much easier. The closer you get to a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio, the more shake you'll have to manage, never mind the slower shutter speed you're going to need as you move towards smaller f-stops to expand that depth of field. These are the two basic things that scream mirrorless cameras, EVF and IBIS. But hold that thought while we move on to lenses, which are the most important part of your macro kit. Although I'm not forgetting about tripods or lights, hold that thought too. When it comes to macro lenses, you have three decisions to make: zoom or prime, what focal length, and what focus technology. I'll just cut to the chase. First, I think dedicated macro prime lenses are the way to go because A, they are optically superior to even the best macro zooms for a given focal length at maximum magnification, that is, minimum focusing distance. B, they offer higher maximum magnification than macro zooms. C, they are easier to hold steady than macro zooms because they are inevitably smaller and lighter. And D, they are almost always optically superior to their non-macro zoom and prime equivalents at normal shooting distances too. Macro lenses' only deficit usually being a slower maximum aperture, which actually is no deficit at all if you are using aperture as your primary tool to increase depth of field. Although, an example that proves the almost always optically superior to their non-macro prime equivalence rule is in the APS-C space, where Sony's 30mm f3.5 macro, introduced in 2011, doesn't hold a candle to Sigma's newer 31.4, introduced in 2016, which, now that I mention it, is another important point. Lens performance has risen sharply over the last half decade or so. Then again, some of us will argue that these newer lenses, macro or not, are too clinical, which I understand, although by and large I do not share that point of view. To my way of thinking, too clinical simply means high resolution, corner to corner, more pop, and less field curvature, all of which I usually appreciate. Which is why, for years as a young man, I preferred my manual focus Canon FL50 3.5 macro to my 51.8 as my general purpose go-to for landscapes, buildings, cityscapes, as well as true macro photography, basically everything except portrait. Second, when it comes to focal length, well, it turns out that you're usually limited to, I know I'm using that word too much, bear with me, roughly two fields of view, 50mm and 90mm, give or take up to, call it 15mm either side in either case. I'm talking full frame here. You can do the math for APS-C and micro four thirds on the one hand, medium or large format on the other, using crop factors of 1.52 and usually, there's that word again, 0.8 for digital medium format. Call these normal and portrait field of view lenses, although when it comes to macro photography, a portrait field of view also includes subjects like bugs, lizards, snakes. You do want enough distance so that insects don't fly off or at you, or so that any of these things don't successfully attack you. One of the very first lenses I bought for our Sony system years ago was their eyeball-peelingly sharp, image-stabilized 92.8 G macro with true 1-to-1 maximum magnification. I intended to use it for product shots, in fact, and portraits, so the longer focal length made more sense for my needs. Not for bugs, lizards, or snakes, oh my. Or flowers, not my thing, brown thumb. Although, one of the greatest, again, air quotes, macro lenses of all time is neither a normal or classic portrait field of view, but instead a wide angle and not quite capable of that minimum 0.5x threshold I posited a few minutes ago. Leica's integrated, non-interchangeable, autofocusing manual Summilux 28 1.7 on their Q series, a lens that focuses all the way down to 6.7 inches with, call it, a reproduction ratio of about 1 to 3 or 2.5x magnification. Another non-traditional focal length and one of the most interesting macro lenses of recent memory is Venus Optics manual focus 24mm f14 probe lens with a 1 to 0.5 maximum reproduction ratio. Oh, baby. Back to the long end, Claudia and I were super impressed with Sigma's 105 2.8 DGDN macro art lens in L-mount. Just incredibly tasty. Although, as is usually the case with macro lenses now that I think about it, its autofocus was notably slower than, say, Sigma's own 85 1.4 DGDN art on her Leica CL. I haven't had it in hand, but there's Nikon's new autofocusing and image-stabilized Nikkor Z 105 2.8 macro, and I love every one of the Z primes I've ever tried. It is, however, worth mentioning that back in the pre-Z mount days, 2006 to be precise, Nikon introduced the very first macro lens with image stabilization, the highly regarded Nikkor 105 2.8G IF ED AFS VR. And while we're talking old school, I loved my even older Canon EF 100 2.8 macro, not the more expensive L, just plain macro, which could also go down to 1:1. Though it is not in the same league as these much newer, state-of-the-art, and much more expensive portrait-length macros. All of which is a long way of saying, you don't have to buy new to buy great and have fun, which is why KEH is sponsor of this video. You don't have to go full frame either, as I alluded to earlier. In the APS-C space, there's Leica's wonderfully capable and beautifully built, if non-image stabilized and very pricey, Apo Elmerit TL62.8 macro aspherical. This is a true macro like the lenses I've just mentioned, with 1:1 magnification offering the full-frame equivalent field of view and depth of field of a 90 f4, making it easily capable of double duty with spectacular results. Fujifilm's APS-C coverage XF 80mm 2.8 is another true macro lens, but it does have onboard lens IS, and offering a full-frame equivalent field of view and depth of field of a 120 f4, it is, candidly, a more flexible offering than the Elmerit at a fraction of the price. Compatible with 3 Fujifilm cameras that have in-body image stabilization and articulating screens that the CL and TL series cameras do not, the X1H, the X-T4, and the XS10. I'd say that Fujifilm is the sweet spot in APS-C macro photography. Things are a little more challenging when it comes to the Micro Four Thirds ecosystem because the inherently deeper depth of field of that ecosystem, combined with Panasonic's and Olympus's desire, naturally enough, to keep their lenses smaller than full frame, have led to a higher probability, at least in my experience, of needing 2 lenses. I bought and loved Olympus's fast, petite, also beautifully built Micro Four Thirds 75 1.8, the full frame equivalent field of view and depth of field of a 153.6. It rendered portraits in a way that, to my eye, basically screamed macro-level performance. I was blown away by what it could do for that use case. Then again, with a 1 to 10 reproduction ratio and only 20 megapixels behind it, I found it too limited for my growing need for product shots. I ended up selling it as my priorities shifted from portraiture to product shots and eventually to full frame. But had I remained in the Micro Four Thirds world, I probably would have taken a closer look at Olympus's weather-resistant but non-image stabilized 60mm f2.8 macro. Not that it matters, because the Micro Four Thirds bodies today are all IBIS equipped. All of which, if indirectly, brings us to the third and last decision, manual versus autofocus lenses. So, sure, this really is a matter of budget, convenience, and style of shooting. If you are budget constrained and want to get started with macro photography, a used old school manual focus macro lens can be a fabulous entry point. But I'd say that all else being equal, autofocus is absolutely the way to go. I mean, did you really expect me to say anything different? It's faster and surer than manual focus if you rely on pinpoint AF rather than futzing with or hoping for multi-field AF to be psychic, and keeps you out of the futzing zone. What if you really want the flexibility of a zoom but still want to explore macro? There are a number of versatile 24 to 105 f4 full frame and crop sensor near equivalents, though few of them get to 1 to 2, never mind 1-to-1 reproduction ratios. We did own Sony's image-stabilized 24-105 f4, and it does get as close as 1:3. We've had Panasonic's 24-105 f4 in-house, also image-stabilized, and it gets even closer, 1:2. Both are weather-resistant as well. In the APS-C space, we've had Sigma's 0.3x maximum magnification 18-52.8 in hand. In Micro Four Thirds, we've owned the 0.3x maximum magnification Leica DG Vario Elmarit 12-60 f2.8-4. All of these lenses can be good starting points in your photographic journey, especially if you intend to explore close-up videography where the resolution requirements are less. I will tell you, however, that none of them offer image quality comparable to dedicated macro lenses of the same modern vintage for macro photography. And if zooming and macroing as futz-free as possible is your goal, don't underestimate the power of your smartphone. What about lights? What about tripods? If you think for a moment about police procedurals and crime scene forensic teams, you're probably thinking ring flash with no tripod. As well you should. Although you may have noticed at the beginning that I finally sold my Canon ring light, a great piece of kit, to KEH because, as I said earlier, I barely used it. More generally, flash makes a great deal of sense for macro photography because it is relatively less obtrusive and can freeze action the way continuous lighting, in combination even with higher shutter speeds, usually can't, especially if you use flash combined with a tripod and a motion trigger. Think bugs. Or lizards, or snakes. Ew. Although, never mind my squeamishness. The best close-ups of insects, any animal, any plant really, reveal the stunning complexity, adaptability, and sometimes cruel beauty of life.
I can't believe my eyes when I get close to you, close to you, close to you.
Videography, of course, is a different story, and then it's all about LEDs. I prefer single chip on board lights with diffusers because A, they are far less likely than HMI lights to fry the subject, and B, a diffused COB light offers much better and simpler specular highlights with a far less busy set of shadows in the background than undiffused LED panels. And LED panels don't have the same breadth and depth of light modifiers. On the other hand, irrespective of subject type, if your subject isn't moving, a different kind of tool to consider for photography, a software process-enabled, better on some cameras than others, and not available for videographers, complemented by a very solid tripod, is exposure stacking. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is the process of firing off in quick succession a series of images of the same frame with different focal points, which you can then blend in post to create essentially infinite depth of field, which can, in turn, relieve you to some extent of the burden of working exclusively with the smallest apertures, which by dint of diffraction and higher ISOs conspire to degrade your image. I'm talking especially about cameras like Panasonic's full-frame S1R and S5, or Fujifilm's APS-C X-T4, which make focus stacking a breeze by automating it under their bracketing submenus. Although, and I probably should have mentioned this as another decision parameter at the outset, a singular advantage of a full-frame camera like the S1R, currently unavailable on APS-C or Micro Four Thirds cameras, is the ability to combine focus bracketing with a 40-plus megapixel high-resolution sensor. No need to futz with longer lenses or the tripod almost invariably necessary for pixel shifting with sub-40 megapixel cameras like Panasonic's 25-plus megapixel GH6. Then again, the GH6 does have IBIS so exceptional that I have been able to capture normal size and distance images handheld. But even so, I wouldn't count on any IBIS system for macro shots. At which point, right, we're talking tripods, stable tripods, which are generally neither particularly small nor particularly light. My favorites these days are mid-level models from FLM and Three-Legged Thing, though in a crunch for lighter weight and smaller size, my favorite remains Peak Design's carbon fiber travel tripod, weighted and stabilized by a bag of sand or rocks or a filled water bottle attached to the center column hook. I'd caution you to avoid less stable tripods like Manfrotto's Be Free series. Anyway, that's it for now. Musings about a genre of photography that, as the weather turns warmer, many of us will be more inclined to pursue. I encourage you to do so, and if you have the time and inclination, I encourage you to share your thoughts and recommendations in the comments section below. A big shout out to KEH for sponsoring this video, a great resource for finding just this kind of gear. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.